Hey folks, this is Dr. Duncan, your BI 101 instructor, and we're here with part 2 of Unit 14b, which is our introduction to wetlands, a brief interlude where we define what wetlands are and look at their importance. So we're going to be looking at a lot of different types of wetlands over the next couple weeks as we explore parts of Alabama, which begs the question, what is a wetland? And that's what we're going to tackle now. Um, Wetland is defined in many ways, but one of the most conventional is to say that it is an area where water is the primary factor for controlling plant and animal life. And we tend to base the definition of wetlands, when we get down to the specifics, we tend to base it on four different things. First of all, the presence of aquatic plants. Those plants are there long term, and so when you see plants that have adaptations that show that they're adapted for living in wet environments, that's a good indication that you have a wetland. These plants can be floating, or they could be submerged species that never cross the surface of the water. Some of these plants might not be either of those. They might be like cypress trees, which are emergent plants. So they can be floating, emergent, or submergent. Aquatic plants being one of the most important signs for defining what is a wetland. A second defining term is the ecotone. That is basically a change in the structure and composition of an ecosystem. So in the picture on the right, you see a transitional zone from a wetland to the left to the upland terrestrial area to the right. That zone that's right in the middle there is called the ecotone, and it tends to be a pretty abrupt change between the two different habitats. In the satellite imagery that you see at the bottom left, you can see that someone who was delineating a wetland for some project has drawn a thin blue line there illustrating where the edges are of the wetland. And the transition is abrupt enough that you can actually see this from space. So the presence of that ecotone is another critical piece to defining what is a wetland. A third piece is to look at the soils, and this is where you got to get down into the muck and dig it out to take a careful look at it. Turns out that wetland soils universally tend to have certain characteristics. Most notably, when you pull up the soils, you're going to see a very gray color instead of a black color. And the reason is that it has a lot to do with the microbes that are down below the surface of the substrate. So if you're standing in a wetland and your feet are sinking down into the mud, they're down below and into the substrate. And that substrate down there is very low in oxygen, which means that the processes that involve the decay of plant material, instead of creating a darker color like you would get in, say, topsoil on land, you get this grayish coloration. So that color mark is really indicative of when you've got soils that are waterlogged for long periods of time throughout the course of the year. Of course, the surface of those soils is going to be dark, but that gray stuff is down below, as you see in this plug that's been dug up. Okay, so those are three of the characteristics. A fourth characteristic, or final characteristic, has to do with the duration and seasonality of water. Now, water does not have to be present all year long in order to define a wetland. Instead, it has to be the dominant component of the wetland for much of the year. That means that the wetland can be dry for part of the year. Here you see two pictures of a cypress tupelo swamp. At the left you see it in early spring when there's lots of water on the landscape. At the right you see it in the early fall because it's been during the drought times and it's been very dry for a long period. It's still a wetland even though there's not water out there, and you would know that by looking at the plants, the aquatic plants, the soils, and what else do we mention here? Oh, and the ecotone, of course. The ecotone there between that tupelo swamp and the surrounding hardwood forest. Okay, so those are the ways in which we define wetlands. Now, we can classify wetlands into several different categories. There are open systems where there's an easy flow of water across the surface. This might be a swamp that's adjacent to a river, for example. Then there's closed systems. These would usually be like sinkhole ponds or other places in the landscape where there's very little exchange of water with the surrounding area. Water comes in, but it doesn't tend to flow across the surface out away from that wetland. Instead, if that water goes anywhere, it's either evaporating or it's sinking down into the groundwater. So open and closed are two ways of classifying wetlands. Another way to classify wetlands is whether they're coastal or inland. Coastal wetlands tend to have a high degree of salinity. This would involve our salt marshes and our brackish marshes and mangrove swamps. By the way, brackish, if you're not familiar with it, that's in reference to water that is a mixture of marine water and fresh water. So, for example, if you go to Mobile and you go into the marshes that are up above Mobile in the Mobile-Tensas Delta, those are going to be brackish marshes. So coastal wetlands, like I said before, are really critical for the seafood industry here in the Southeast. Inland wetlands can be categorized in three different types. Don't you like all these ways we classify things? Inland wetlands can be either river systems, we call them riverine systems, they can be lake and pond systems, or they can be these shallow systems that involve very shallow ponds that'll dry up from time to time, seeps, where usually on the base of a hill where water seeps out of the hill because the groundwater can't be contained by the soil anymore, and bog habitats. We'll see some examples of seeps and bogs in some of the subsequent lectures, and you'll get a better idea of what makes those, how those function. Some common wetland terms. You've probably heard the terms swamp and marsh a lot in your life, and certainly in this course, but let's formally define them here. A swamp is a wetland where trees are the dominant plants. Trees or shrubs, either way is good. Basically woody stemmed plants being the dominant plant in those wetlands. A marsh, however, is going to have lots of plants, but they're not going to be woody plants. They're not going to be trees and shrubs. Instead, they're going to be grasses and sedges and rushes, these plants that essentially look like tall grasses. Okay, so those are a couple terms you need to be familiar with. And with that, we are done with our brief introduction to wetlands, and we'll be using these terms as we explore some of the wetlands that we have in Alabama. And that concludes part 2 of Unit 14b, and that's it.